One of the most important legislative achievements during the 20th century was the passage of the Social Security law. Here is a picture of President Franklin D. Roosevelt signing that law on August 14, 1935. If you look over his left shoulder, the lady with the hat is Frances Perkins, his Secretary of Labor. Now, the reason this law was passed during the Depression is that there were so many older Americans aged 65 and beyond who were unable to care for their basic necessities. About 2/3 of Americans of that age group were unable. 1/3 depended on their family, the other third depended on public assistance, of which there was very little at the time. So, the Congress and the President created this tax on payroll that contributed to supplemental pensions to be earned after age 65. The first American to collect under Social Security was Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont. During her 3 years of working under Social Security, she contributed $22.54. The first check she got, $24 is what she contributed, $22 is what she got in her first check. Now, Mrs. Fuller, as I noted here, had the good sense to live to be 100, so she collected $22,888 in total benefits. This is still a supplemental insurance program, a supplemental retirement program intended to help Americans force savings so they will not be penniless in old age. It still operates on that basis. Related to that, and 30 years later, Medicare was signed. Medicare is a health care program, a hospitalization program, that again depends on payroll taxes. People pay into Medicare. Medicare Part A was signed on July 30th, 1965. It provided for hospital care. Medicare Part B, which requires a premium to be paid for those who elect its coverage, covers physicians. So this is a program that really attracted a lot of opposition on the other side. And in fact, Ronald Reagan was one of the spokesmen, and they typically use the epithet, this is going to be socialized medicine. Well, in fact, it was universalized, at least for people over age 65. And again, people pay through their payroll taxes. So this is not a giveaway. This is a prepaid insurance program that Americans who work and have their payroll taxes. So it has been a remarkable, I think, opportunity and advantage for older Americans. In the same way, 2 years later, the Age Discrimination Act was signed. In fact, until that time, there was no reason an employer couldn't either fire somebody or say they would not hire a person of a certain attained age. Nope, you're too old for this job. And so this law helps protect employees from such unscrupulous employers. Now, it's hard to imagine, but before December 31st of 1970, there was no protection for the clean air in America. And in fact, if you would go out to Los Angeles before that time, you would see smog, which is basically particulate discharge, and people couldn't breathe. And luckily, the Democratic Congress and President Nixon agreed this would be important to do. Since then, we've seen significant improvement, and there have been regulations. For example, if you drive past the Iatan power plant, the gas-powered plant just south of us, or coal-powered plant, what you see coming out of that smokestack is in fact water vapor. They have scrubbed out the other elements before they're discharged into the air. In the same way, the federal water pollution control amendments were passed in 1972. Because there were no regulations prior to 1972 that protected our groundwater supply, rivers, from having sewage dumped right into them. And now this is regulated, which seems to make sense, doesn't it? From dangerous and untreated sewage in the water. In November 1973, the Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. This was an attempt, actually a late post hoc attempt, to try to limit the ability of the president to declare war and to commit U.S. troops under whatever argument the president would make. Now, the interesting thing is that the United States has been in what you would have to call wars. Korea, of course, was a police action taken with the United Nations. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, so many of these, all without declarations of war. The War Powers Resolution Act has been ignored largely by presidents because they're supposed to report to Congress shortly after they commit U.S. troops. But it reminds us that the constitutional order is a delicate order. And while this was well-meaning, the War Powers Resolution did not achieve what it finally aimed to do. About the same time in 1973, the Consumer Protection Act was created. And here in the illustration you see some of the particular requirements related to baby cribs. And the same is true for power lawnmowers. You see they have dead man switches, so if you let go of it, the lawnmower is not going to run over an animal or a child. You see they have shield guards. Before 1973, I used to cut the grass at home, and our Toro lawnmower, if we didn't have a bag on the side, would shoot out rocks, and it would, could kill a dog at 50 yards. I mean, it was really a dangerous instrumentality. I never killed a dog, and I wouldn't kill dogs, but you get the idea. A whole series of products that you grew up with were subject to this law and this regulation, which I think makes sense again. Again, in 1974, about the same time, the Clean Water Act became law, and it really gave authority to local governments and the federal government to set health-based standards for our drinking water. Why it took so long, almost 200 years into the Republic, before we created such standards, I can't explain to you, but this, I submit, is probably very important. You only have to go back about 4 years to Flint, Michigan, to see an example of drinking water gone wrong. In March of 1990, a group of disabled people protested in Washington, D.C. And if you were disabled prior to this time, there were no public accommodations made for you, no ramps, no accommodations of any kind. So 60 of the 1,000 people who were at this March 12th demonstration decided to crawl up the 83 steps up to the Capitol to dramatize how they were cut out of the American society. Here's a picture of President George H.W. Bush signing this Americans with Disabilities Act into law. I think it's been a very important piece of federal legislation in the 20th century. In the same way, in 1997, the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, was created. Now, there's a series of children who were too poor for Medicaid, whose families, had too much income for Medicaid and couldn't qualify for that. So these were children who came into that gap. And again, right now, about 7 million children. I think this is an important legislative enactment where we spread the costs among all of us so that the few, relatively few, 7 million who really need this health care may get it. This is the story of federal laws that succeeded. Now, I'm the first to tell you that not every federal law adopted during the 20th century was worthwhile and should still be on the books. But these are examples of laws that were worthwhile, served noble purposes, and still serve those purposes because these are federal laws that succeeded.